David R. DiNardo says, I really actually want to take this question. I've had variations on this for a while. I've heard John Denver died in a Long Easy crash. Someone close to me hates the idea of me wanting one. You've made me want to become a pilot and one day own a plane as cool as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which is actually called the Hummin' Tiger now because we got the engine fixed, but nevertheless. Are Long Easies generally safe aircraft? They are, in many ways, the safest aircraft in the sky. And I want to talk about the John Denver crash, and I'll talk about the Long Easy. John Denver bought the aircraft from... I know the person who sold him the airplane, although I only knew him many, many years after the accident. The Long Easy is a plans-built aircraft that was designed by Burt Rutan off of his Very Easy. The Very Easy was his second significant design. His first one was called a Very Viggen. So here's young Burt Rutan, just a kid, and he wants a fighter jet like everybody else. And because he's Burt Rutan and not Bill Whittle, for example, he doesn't spend years in the theater department wandering around and, complaining about things. He goes out and builds a design of his own called the Very Viggen, which was based loosely on the Saab Viggen fighter, kind of a delta wing vehicle, and he built it out of plywood. He just designed it and built it through a Volkswagen engine, I think, on the back, or half a Volkswagen engine, cut it in half, put that in there, and off he went. And it flew really well. If you've ever seen Death Race 2000, by the way, for you trivia fans out there, with the old movie with David Carradine, at the very end of that movie, there's this kind of, the movie shot in the 70s, so there's this futuristic airplane that's kind of following this road warrior guy across, and it's doing these right-angle banks and popping behind hills and up and down and flying almost inverted at 100 feet. That is a Very Viggen, and it's piloted by Burt frickin' Rutan. So, the Very Viggen is a plywood machine. Burt watched people making models. He came up with his moldless composites, made the Very Easy, and then almost very quickly, I think within a year or two, realized it needed more fuel, needed better wing attachment, and he made the Long Easy, which became the basis of the Bearcoot, which our friend James Redman has the best of show, best of breed model out there, and they're fantastic airplanes. So the point of the Long Easy is it's made from plans. You really do get just a giant series of blueprints. The genius of what Burt did was he realized that if you could get a block of foam, and they sell this stuff all over the place now, blue foam basically, and let's say you want to make the wing of a Long Easy. Well, a wing has to be a very precise plan form. Right? It has to be curvy on the top, has to be flat on the bottom, and for the wing to perform efficiently and effectively, that design actually changes. The wing root, the part of the wing that's close to the airplane is bigger. It gets smaller as it gets further out. I think most people probably realize that. And also, it changes its shape. The airfoil changes as it goes into it. You want the inside of the wing to stall before the outside of the wing, so you want to make the inside wing curvier. And the reason you want the inside of the wing to stall before the outside is because if the wing stalls on the inside, the ailerons, which are controlling the roll, are still flying, so that's the idea. It's called washout. Now, what Burt realized was that there's a template for the inside of the wing, the near part close to the fuselage, and then there's a series of different templates that change their shape as they get further and further outboard. And what he realized was, he said, if I cut just some life-size program, just gave you life-size blueprints of this, and you cut this out of the paper, literally cut it out with scissors, and put it on a block of wood or a piece of thin metal, and you made that block of wood or metal in the just basically sand it or cut it, or to the shape of this printed plan that I'm giving you, and you space these things 5 feet apart or whatever, right? Then what you could do is you could take a hot wire and you could stretch it between these two pieces of wood. And it's a very primitive looking thing. You literally just a couple of alligator clips and stick it on a rheostat, and this wire gets really hot. And if you put these plans that I gave you and cut them out and put them on wood or metal, and you put them on two ends of this block at a known distance, and you took this wire and you ran the wire over the foam, what would happen is that the wire would go through the foam like a hot knife through butter, but it wouldn't go through the metal templates of the airfoil. And if you did it smoothly and you move these wires over these two templates on either end, when you were done and you pulled the templates off, you'd have a piece of foam that would be precisely the airfoil you were looking for. Precisely the airfoil. Now, you've got the foam, which doesn't have any strength at all. You could basically just snap it in half. But if you now have the foam and the foam has the shape, the foam's got the shape, and you take a simple piece of bidirectional fiberglass, which I think is called a Rutan weave, a bid, bidirectional fiberglass. And you take fiberglass and you just basically mix up your epoxy and you slop it down over the foam, and you lay this piece of cloth over this foam, and you do a number of layups. You keep laying up more and more of this very strong cloth. The cloth will bear the loads. The cloth is strong enough. There's a spar that you build that goes through the middle as well. But the outside of the wing on a Long Easy is fiberglass, and the inside is essentially non-structural foam in terms of not taking any load, but it's giving you the shape, and it worked like a charm. You know what? Either Foghorn or James, if you're watching, I forget what the two. Bert said that. I think he said that a Long Easy is it made out of diapers and honey or tablecloths and honey, something like that. I think basically what he's saying that a Long Easy is made out of, the honey is the epoxy, which gets very hard and very strong, and it's just literally a piece of cloth. You just lay these things down, and it's incredibly strong, very, very great design. So the thing about the Long Easy that's so remarkable, there's many remarkable things about the Long Easy, but the thing that's most remarkable about the canard design is the Long Easy doesn't look like other airplanes. It looks like it's flying backwards. Most airplanes have the engine in the front with a propeller. It's called a tractor propeller, and the propeller pulls the plane through the air. And the tail is where the, sticking out behind, the tail is where the elevators, which control your pitch, nose up and nose down, that controls your speed. The wings have ailerons to control the roll, and that's pretty much the same on the Long Easy as it is on a conventional airplane. But Bert decided to put the tail in the front and the engine in the back, just the way the Wright brothers did, strangely enough. The Wright brothers' first airplane that ever flew was a pusher canard, just like a Long Easy. Engines pushing in the back, a little wing up in the front called a canard, which was going to raise or lower the nose and tell the main wing what to do. So far, so good. There are many interesting things about this, though. Most people don't know this, but anything from a Cessna 172 to a Boeing 747, any traditionally configured airplane, the tail actually pushes down. There is aerodynamic loads on the airplane pushing the airplane down. If you want to make something fly, and you've got to lift a large amount of weight, you would want all of your aerodynamic forces going up, wouldn't you? But in every traditional airplane, you have to put enough power and enough lift in there to overcome the fact that the tail is pushing down. It's actually generating an aerodynamic force that pushes down. I don't know when I learned that. I was a flight student in 91. I thought I knew a lot about airplanes, but I didn't realize that until I actually started learning napkins and honey. Thank you, Foghorn. The reason it pushes down is because if the tail's in the back, think about this for a second, but if the tail is constructed in such a way that the force of the load is down, then what happens? Well, in straight and level flight, the plane is straight and level. That's why we call it straight and level flight. You got a certain power setting, your elevators are set, and you're just flying along at 100 knots or 500 knots or whatever, right? Everything's copacetic. Now, if all of a sudden you were to go faster, right, what happens? Well, as you go faster, the aerodynamic load on the tail gets stronger, and it pushes the tail down, which is what it's designed to do. Pushing the tail down makes the nose go up, and making the nose go up slows the airplane down. So it's a feedback mechanism. It means that the airplane doesn't get into runaway airspeed dives. If the nose of the airplane goes down for whatever reason, the pilot falls asleep or whatever, the plane starts going faster and faster and faster. And if this design wasn't built into it, the plane would just accelerate. It wouldn't even have time to crash. It would break up in the air as it got so fast it just exceed the aerodynamic loads on the structure, come apart. But with this conventional design, on any airplane from a 747 to a Cessna 150, if somebody falls asleep at the wheel and the plane starts going down, it starts moving faster. As it moves faster, the aerodynamic loads on the tail increase, and they push down harder on the tail. And since the tail's behind the center of gravity, as the plane goes faster and faster and faster, the nose starts to come up. And that automatically saves you from coming to pieces. And the reverse works as well. If it turns out that you're in a stall where you're going slower and slower and slower, the nose is coming up and you're going slower and slower and slower, the load on the tail gets less and less and less because you're moving slower through the air. That means the tail comes up. The tail coming up means the nose goes down. And these things tend to stabilize the airplane in flight. It makes an airplane fun to fly instead of a death trap like the Spirit of St. Louis or in many configurations the Voyager. But Bert realized that if you put the wing up front, the tail up front, you could do the same thing. You could control the pitch of the airplane with the little wing up front called a canard, and as you went faster, that would generate more lift, which would raise the nose, which is what you want. And if you got in a dive, it would generate more lift and raise the nose. Likewise, if you're going too slow, it would put the nose down. So the first advantage of the Long Easy design is pretty simple. Everything's going up. Nothing's pushing down, so they're a lot more efficient. But there's a much better reason for the canard, and it's much safer. A large percentage of fatal accidents in general aviation are caused by aerodynamic stall. Now, a stall is not the same as when the engine stalls. I had an engine stall, but it didn't have an aerodynamic stall. We'll go up and practice aerodynamic stalls and not have an engine stall. So what happens in a stall is this. A wing is basically works as an airfoil because when the leading edge of the wing hits air, the air has to make a decision. Some of the air goes over the top, some of the air goes under the bottom. The bottom of the wing is flat, the top of the wing is curved. The air that has to go over the top of the wing has to travel more distance because they have to go around side the arc while the circumference, while the air that goes on the bottom of the wing in a straight line just travels the radius. So since the air on the top has to go further, it's accelerating. It's got to get to the back at the same time because air pressure is pushing it. All the air wants to be in the same place all the time. That's why a plane flies. All the air wants to be in the same place at the same time. So the air over the top of the wing has to accelerate to get to the back of the wing faster. And as it accelerates, it becomes less dense. There's fewer air molecules. It means it's lower pressure. The pressure on the bottom of the wing is higher than the pressure on the top of the wing, and the lift goes up. And that is non-mechanical to the degree that you don't need an engine for it. If you're moving that airfoil through the air, you will generate lift. Hooray. The problem is that it's nonlinear. In other words, if you're flying at 60 knots or 100 knots and you get a certain amount of lift and you come down to 80 knots, you get less lift. You get to 60 knots, you get less lift. You get to 40 knots, you get less lift. But when you get to 20 knots, you get no lift because somewhere around on my little on my other airplane, the Sky Arrow, right at 40 knots, which is practically walking speed. It's very slow for an airplane. It depends on the wing and the load and everything else. But there comes a point where instead of it just continuing to make less and less lift, it comes to a point when the wing is moving so slowly that the air basically says, you know what, screw it, we're out of here. And it stops conforming to the top of the wing. It just breaks off. The wing just stops working. And that's called a stall. And once the wing is stalled, it's not a wing anymore. And if you don't have a wing anymore, it's not an airplane anymore. It's just 1,200 pounds of aluminum and steel, and it's coming down like any other piece of aluminum and steel. So aerodynamic stall, when the wing stalls, is what gets people into trouble. If they stall on a base to final turn where they're 300-400 feet, the plane stops flying, and normal recovery, you put the nose down and you gain your speed back and your angle of attack. It's not just speed. I'm not going to get into that right now. But basically it's speed for all intents and purposes. You get enough speed back over the wing, and then the wing starts flying again, but it takes 700-800 feet in some cases to do that. And if you're 300 feet above the ground, then you're not going to have a good time. So people get killed on low-level stalls into the ground when people lose their engine, which has happened to me 3 times. The natural instinct when you feel the plane when you want the plane to climb and you want to go up, when the engine goes out, the natural inkling is to pull back. That slows the airplane down very quickly because you don't have a power plant anymore. And if that happens and that wing starts going too slow, it's not a wing, it's not an airplane, and in you go, and they read about you in the newspapers. So the reason I think I've dealt with 3 engine failures so effectively was because I learned in gliders I didn't have an engine in gliders. When the tow rope broke, engines hardly ever fail. I'm very unfortunate in that regard, but ropes break frequently. So on a rope break, nose down, nose down, nose down, nose down, nose down, nose down, instantly. Power gun, nose down. Now you're in a glider. You can glide and you can land, and there's not a civil aviation airplane that if you land at minimum airspeed under control, you're almost certainly going to walk away from that. Cessna's land at 60 knots, and mine landed at 40. You know, break your feet or something like that. People die because the plane goes into the ground at a very steep angle. If you land flat at a low energy rate at 40 knots, you're carrying a certain amount of energy. At 80 knots, you're not carrying twice as much energy, you're carrying 4 times as much energy, as square. So if you land level and at slow speeds, your chances of surviving are very good, even if you go into terrible terrain. So it's the stall that kills you, the aerodynamic stall. And traditional airplanes, when they would stall, they would often break and fall down on a side. And if you're not careful, you can get into a spin, and the spin is a case, you can't have a spin unless both wings are stalled. And then to recover from a spin is actually pretty straightforward, but I'm here to tell you I've done spins, I've done a number of spins, and the first time you go into a spin, you are scared out of your wits because you kind of think you're kind of level, but I mean a spin, you are looking down at the ground and you are just woo, woo, woo. It gets your attention. It gets your attention in a big way. It's like, that's why we train. Okay, so I'm going to spin, neutral aileron, stick forward, opposite rudder, and just wait. If you try to do what you want instinctively to do, which is aileron your way, roll your way out of a stall, you'll keep in the stall until you hit the ground. Neutral elevators, nose down, opposite rudder. Let the rudder do its job, and you'll come out of the stall. But you can't do that at low altitude. So anyway, blah, 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 blah. Traditional airplanes stall because the main wing loses its lift and it drops. And then you either get out of it or you don't. But if it happens at low level, you don't have the altitude to get out of it. Now, Rutan realized, I didn't mean to say Rutan, I meant to say my buddy Bert, realized that if you set the angle of the forward wing, I'm not talking about the angle of the elevators, I mean the angle at which it's bolted to the airframe. If that little forward wing, which is generating lift, unlike the tail, which is not generating lift, it's generating anti-lift, if you set the forward wing to generate lift and you set the angle of the forward wing at a higher angle than the main wing, that meant that almost under any conditions, no matter what you did to the airplane, no matter what kind of crazy pull-up you did, no matter how slow you flew, if you put the nose up to the point where in a traditional airplane the main wing would stall and down it would go, Bert realized that if he sets the canard at a certain angle, since the canard is controlling the pitch, it's controlling the up and down position of the nose, he realized, if I set that at a higher angle, as that nose comes up, that forward wing is going to stall before the main wing, which is carrying most of the load of the airplane, stalls, which means that if the canard stalls first, the second the canard loses lift, the nose is going to drop. And if the nose drops, then the main wing is going to keep flying. You cannot stall a canard airplane. I mean, people have made a major effort to, but if that airplane is properly loaded within its published legal weights and balances, it is impossible to stall a canard. You can pull a canard through a turn, a low-level turn, an insane maneuver. You could do it at 300 feet above the ground in a 60-degree bank, turning to final, haul back on that stick, which would be a death sentence in anything else. And in a canard, as that canard starts working harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, finally the canard's going to run out of authority, the canard's going to stall, but the main wing, which is carrying most of you, is going to keep on flying. And when that canard stalls in the turn, the nose is going to drop, and it's going to reduce your turn angle, and you're just going to fly the way right out of there. It's a fantastic airplane. It's virtually impossible to stall a canard. Virtually impossible. And as B.D. Cates says, Bill will eventually get to the point of the John Denver crash. I had to make the case for the Long Easy before I talk about John Denver, because you have to understand that the aerodynamics of the Long Easy make a canard-driven Long Easy, in my opinion, a well-built canard where there's no manufacturing products, because it's not made by a factory. It's made by an individual. It has to pass an inspection, but if the guy built it well, it's terrific. If he didn't build it well, you might have problems. But the design is, in fact, the safest design in the sky. I think it's the safest design ever made. It's virtually impossible. And they're so clean, and since everything's lifting and they're so sleek, they'll glide forever. You lose an engine in a Long Easy, you probably have a 20-to-1 glide ratio, and a Cessna, it's probably 12-to-1 or less. So you can go further. You can have more options. Get to a nice field or an airport or something like that. So it's a very, very safe airplane. So what happened to John Denver, and why did John Denver end up getting killed in one of the safest airplanes out there? Well, this is a tragedy. It's a genuine tragedy. There's a couple of genuine tragedies. There's any number of accidents, but there are a number of tragedies. 2 or 3 I can think of. The loss of Spaceship Two was an actual tragedy because of the reason how it happened. I've gotten that before. I'm not going to get into it now. But I'll tell you about 2 tragedies in canards. John Denver's one of them. I loved his music. And not only did I love his music, I thought he was a great guy. He seemed to be a relatively humble guy, didn't seem to be much affected by all this. He was a superb pilot, great glider pilot and biplane pilot, a great, great guy, and I loved his music. So John Denver went looking for a Long Easy to buy. Now, the Long Easies are made from plans, and the plans for the frame and the wings and everything, all that's pretty much standard, landing gear, all the rest. But what you do with the airplane once you've got the shell is entirely up to you. The way you want to wire it, the kind of instruments you want to put into it, or not put into it, pretty much open. The plans are plans, right? The plans say, do this way. But since you are the builder, and you are therefore essentially the designer, the experimental aviation laws say that if you build more than 50% of the airplane, it's your design. So technically, I don't really own a Long Easy. I own a Don Burton Long Easy. What happened was John went looking for a plane, and there is a limited market of these planes, and my friend who basically brokered the deal said, this is a really nice airplane, John. It's a very nice airplane, and I think it'll suit you well, but this particular single airplane, this one Long Easy out of a fleet of 800 or something, just one, has a really weird modification that the builder put in there, and I think you ought to get it changed back to the way it's supposed to be on the plans before you fly this. And John said, well, what's the modification? Well, the modification is this. In the Long Easy, the fuel selector, because there's a left wing tank and a right wing tank, it used to be left tank, right tank. I've got left, right, and both. I usually fly out of both. I'm taking fuel out of both tanks. But that fuel selector is right between your knees. It's right between your knees, right there where you can get to it, where you can see it, where it's part of your consciousness and so on. Which means that since that's where the fuel is being selected, left tank or right tank, that means the fuel has to flow from behind the pilot where it's stored in the wings and flow up into the front of the cabin between your legs there where you can get to the switch and select which one's being driven, and then it goes back to the engine. And the one guy out of 900 guys or finished Long Easies decided, I don't like the fuel right there between my legs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the fuel in the back of the airplane behind the firewall. And so I'm going to put a fuel selector switch, maybe I think it was behind the firewall, but what I do know for a certain fact was instead of the fuel selector switch, left tank, right tank, off, right between your knees where you're aware of it and where you can reach it, he decided to mount it on a bulkhead right behind the pilot's left shoulder, I want to say. I'm pretty sure it was his left shoulder, right here. Now, the guy built the airplane, and he knew the airplane, so he just got used to it. He'd reach up, and he'd flip the fuel over here and there, that kind of thing like that, right? So these are how fatalities happen in 99 cases out of 100. It's not just one mistake or two mistakes or three mistakes. It's usually 4 or 5 things in succession, and if any one of these things had not happened, it would have broken the causality chain, and we'd be listening to John Denver today. Maybe we're listening to John Denver tell us what a swell guy Obama was, for all we know. So here's what happened. So John took a look at the airplane. He says, beautiful airplane, I love it, I'll take it. And I'll buy it, and we'll take it back to my hangar, and we'll do the modification. We'll get it back the way it should be. Hooray. But I can tell you how this works. You get a new airplane, you want to fly your new airplane. I can attest to this with a great deal of personal recent experience. So John decided, took the plane, possession of the plane, took it, I think it was back to his home field, I'm not sure. It was not far from here. It was out by Lompoc area, I want to say. And he decided to go for a little afternoon flight, at which point he'd hand it over to my friend who would start to do the modifications, get the fuel selector back right. So John took off just for a quick sunset flight, which I've done many times. A quick flight, at the end of the day, it's getting cool finally, and go out there and just putz around the pattern for 40 minutes and so on. But see, I never fly with less than, I will not do a pattern. I will not do one pattern in the local airport without 45 minutes of fuel on board. I won't. I don't need to. It's just I don't need to worry about it, because if you run out of fuel on the ground, you pull over. You run out of fuel in the air, you got a different kind of problem. So John took off with, I think they said maybe 2-3 gallons, which was probably maybe 20-30 minutes of fuel, and I think all of it was pretty much in one tank. So he's brand new to the airplane. He's a very capable pilot. It's not a question of can he fly the airplanes, but he's new to the systems in the airplane, and no two of them are the same. My airplane is different than James's, which is different than Mike Melville's, which is different than Dick Rutan's. They're all different. They're all unique. So John Denver takes off with essentially very little fuel, flies out over the ocean, and the next thing you know, there's a splash in the ocean, and they go to retrieve the body, and there's nothing left but ripped up pieces of fiberglass and an engine on the bottom of the ocean. So what happened? Well, as I said, a number of things had to happen, and they all had to happen in the right order, and they all had to happen in a certain way, otherwise he'd be home. What happened, I think, what we generally think happened was he was out over the ocean. He took off with very little fuel. That was a fatal mistake, putting the airplane aside. It's a fatal mistake. But he knew he had enough fuel, you see. He wouldn't just go out with no fuel. He didn't have enough fuel. But what happened was he was at low level out of the ocean having a fine time in his wonderful, fun little rocket ship, and the engine started to sputter. And he realized it was sputtering because the tank that he had selected was out of fuel, but there was fuel in the other tank. So what he has to do is he has to switch from the left to the right or the right to the left. I do not know which one it was, but he was fuel starvation because one tank was empty. He knew he had 4 or 5 gallons or whatever left, and it was in the other tank. Now, if it had been me, I would just reach down. I fly with both tanks, but if it had been standard Long Easy, just reach down, flip the tank right there. Instantly, the fuel goes right to the end and boom, fires right up again, and off you go. But John had to do this. He had to come back here and flip this thing, and he wasn't familiar with the positions of the indents, And what they found in the after-accident report, when they took a test pilot up in a Long Easy, they took a fuel selector thing, a dummy valve. It didn't work, but they put it up there and made it feel like the valve. And they had a number of test pilots go up to a much higher altitude and say, okay, now reach over and switch the tanks. And what every single one of them found is just natural human nature. You can't, I don't think you could do it. You could do it if you were prepared not to do it. But basically, you're sitting in a very confined space like this, and you've got your stick down here and your throttle down here, and you've got your feet on the rudder pedals, which are way ahead of you there. That's how you fly in any airplane. Now, they found time and time and time again, no matter how many times they tried to do it, that when you turned to look at this thing and when you turned to switch it to see what was going on, you would push down with your right foot to get the leverage for the turn. You'd push that right foot down. It's almost impossible not to do it. When you turn out of I'm in a rotating chair now. If I were to get out of this chair, I'd push with my right foot to turn the thing to the left, and I'd get up, wouldn't think twice about it. Well, what happened was when he pushed down on that right turn with that right foot and deflected the full right rudder, and the situation with the low airspeed, it basically it rolled the airplane. And it rolled him inverted. And it rolled him inverted at low altitude, and he went into the water, and that was the end of that. So the John Denver accident was not only not due to the Long Easy, because the Long Easy says put your fuel selector between your knees. And if that builder had put that fuel selector where it was supposed to be, look, let me just say this. That builder is building an airplane for himself. It's experimental aviation. If he wants to put the fuel selector, in a kite that follows behind him, that's his business. It's his business. But he deviated from the plans, and that deviation from the plans cost John Denver his life. So to the degree that he bought the one airplane that had the one out of the entire fleet that had that modification, that was bad choice. He didn't get it fixed before he went, but none of that was fatal. The fuel selector wasn't fatal. The previous owner had flown it for probably hundreds of hours, didn't kill him. And it wouldn't have killed John Denver either if he'd had enough fuel in his airplane and had a little time in the airplane and done the fuel tank selection switch a few times just to get the use of it. It was one of those situations, like virtually every other accident in general aviation, where a string of unfortunate things happen in a certain order right on top of each other, and if any one of them hadn't happened, then the accident wouldn't have happened. But they did, and it did, and it's just terrible. And to this day, the Long Easy is tainted with that accident, and it didn't deserve it. And John, see, if you really had to come down with blame, and the only reason you come down with blame, and we're not children in this line of work, we do have to come down with blame. We don't come down with blame so we can beat up the pilot or certainly beat up the dead pilot or his family. We want to come down with blame because we don't want to have it happen again. I don't want to have it happen to me. So if somebody gets killed doing something in an airplane, I have a vested interest in finding out what he did so that I don't have to have that happen to me. I'm not going to live long enough to learn all these things. I have to learn from other people not living long enough to learn these things. So where's the blame lie? Well, it was a bad modification. Didn't really save anything. Nobody's ever been saved from a fire because of that modification, so it didn't get you anything. But just the modification alone didn't do it. I think if you had to put the blame anywhere, it would be on John Denver going for a joyride with very little fuel in an airplane he'd really essentially never flown before. That's crazy to me. I mean, they said when I first flew my Long Easy, they said, don't overload it on fuel, keep it light. And I said, okay, well, what do you need? I don't know, 4 or 5 gallons on a side, something like that. Just for pattern work, I certainly didn't go with less than 7 or 8. I mean, I just don't want to run out of fuel on an airplane. So that's the story of the John Denver Long Easy. David, I'll tell you something. I have enormous confidence in that design. I have enormous confidence in the designer. I have an enormous confidence in the person that built my airplane, and I have an enormous deal of confidence in the design and the strength of the airplane I fly. And the reason I say all that is because while the Cessna 172 and all of these certified Pipers and everything else are extraordinarily good airplanes, there's nothing wrong with them, they are very expensive, and you don't get a whole lot of performance. When you look at what you get for what you spend, the Long Easy is without question the best buy in aviation, and I believe it is an incredibly safe and fun airplane to fly. It's virtually impossible to get yourself killed in it. That's what they said about the Piper Cub, by the way. The Piper Cub is generally acknowledged to be the most friendly, safe, simple airplane in the sky, and instructors in the Piper Cub would say, son, you're about to get into a Piper Cub. It is the friendliest, safest airplane in the sky. It can just barely kill you. And that's it. Just barely kill you. So, anyway, Yeah, I'm very sorry about that. And he deserved better, and the plane deserved better, but we're human beings and we make mistakes. We want to go flying, so we go flying. As always, it's the psychological factors, right? I talked about that in that Crash in Mojave Firewall about Spaceship Two. The demons up there are not Mach tuck or aerodynamic flutter. The demons are our psychology. The demons are built into the fact that we are not designed to be going through the air at 200 miles an hour or 80 or at all. We're not designed to be going through the air at all. We're designed to roam the plains and throw spears at things. And that we can do it at all is a miracle, but we take our psychology with us up there, get there-itis. You've made plans to be at a destination, and you can often get your way out of that in terms like, well, here I am ready to go, but the conditions are crud. I guess I better stay. Some pilots have the moral courage to do that, but when you've got a girlfriend or a girlfriend and her girlfriend and that girl's boyfriend, and they're all waiting for you, and he has to be at work that morning or else he's going to get fired, and conditions are spotty but likely clear along the route, and we can always just go and check, and you start asking yourself all these questions, start justifying all this. Then you get into an airplane, you fly out across the sound, and you're out over the open water on your way up to a relative's big wedding that you promised everybody you'd be there for, and you're one of the most famous people in the world, and you have had some instrument training, but you don't have an instrument rating, and conditions turn to zero visibility, and the next thing you know, you feel like you're in a right climbing turn, but you're actually in a left descending spiral, and you find that being the son of John Kennedy doesn't do you any good at all. You just stop trusting the instruments the way you're trained to be, and if you'd finished your training, you wouldn't have been in that trouble. You just feel like you're in a left turn or whatever, and so you pull up to get out of the turn, and you pull yourself into a tighter turn. Next thing you know, you and two other people are killed. And that's not the other tragedy I was going to talk about, by the way. The other tragedy I want to talk about just very briefly is just a horrible thing. It's just to show you the psychological traps. There's a guy out there, I never met him, it was way before I got into experimental aviation, but everybody who knew him seemed to love him. His name was Steve Drybread, and he was a guy who did many things. He designed the retractable landing gear for the Velocity, which I flew for 80 hours, and also did a full retract version for the Long Easy. And Steve Drybread was one of the great canard guys. He knew everything about that airplane. He knew an awful lot about the Berkut, and he was a terrific guy. And like I said, never met him, but I never heard a bad word spoken about him. So Steve Drybread was working on his plane one day on his canard. And the canard, the little wing up in the front, is attached to the airframe through two relatively, you'd be quite surprised at how, I don't want to say flimsy those bolts are, but they're not huge bolts. You think they'd have to be like bolts the thickness of your finger, but there's a couple bolts that hold the canard on that pitch the nose up and down, and those bolts are important because the canard needs to stay on the airplane. And then there's a cosmetic cover that goes over that's not doing any real work at all on the Berkut. I think it was a Berkut. I'm not sure. James will probably know. But the canard is bolted on to the actual bulkhead with these bolts that run down underneath, and then there are a couple of screws that hold just the cosmetic cover over it so that rain doesn't get in there, and so it looks cool. So Steve Drybread was working on his airplane, and he took the canard off to do the work. This happens all the time, and like a conscientious person that he was, he put the bolts on his seat so that he could not sit in the airplane and fly off without those bolts being in place. I don't know the full details of this, but I do know what happened. So something happens. He gets called away. I don't know if it was a phone call or something, and somebody else, I think, this is what I heard, some second party saw the bolts there on the seat or something. They got moved and put them someplace else. So the canard was in place, but it wasn't bolted on. So Steve comes back, and he assumes that it's bolted on, and he puts the sets of screws that cover just the cosmetic cover over the top of the canard and goes out to fly. Now, if that hadn't had the cosmetic cover there, the second he pulled up on the stick to rotate, the canard would have just flown off the airplane, and he'd still be on the runway, and he probably would have skidded off, and it might have been bad, but it would very likely have been survivable. But unfortunately for Steve, the screws that were holding the cosmetic cover on provided enough strength for enough time to, even though the canard was not bolted on, kept the canard in place enough to lift the nose for him to start to climb out. And as he was climbing out and did a turn, I put enough load on that, which wasn't much load at all, and the screws, which were just holding the cosmetic cover on the canard, departed the airplane. The canard departed the airplane, and Steve Drybread went into the ground and was killed. the thing that's so tragic about that, as I said, there's lots of accidents, very few tragedies, is that on some level, you're looking at a guy who was so incredibly capable, so well versed in the long easy and the Bearcoot, and who was so conscientious and careful. He was not doing what John Denver did, running out with a little bit of fuel. He's a very careful guy. Put the bolts right on the seats where they're supposed to be, and he went up and got killed because he made an oversight and some second party got in there. That was the chain of causality. If somebody hadn't moved those bolts, then Steve would have decided, hey, I'm going to go flying, and he would have put the covers on, and he would have, sat there and done everything he would have done that ended up getting him killed. But when he got in the airplane to go flying, he would have had to sit on the bolts and went, oh my God, I wouldn't do it. It's horrible. But somebody moved him, so that wasn't there to save him. So we learn from these things, and we have to. You have to learn from these things. I think a flight instructor told me this late. It wasn't my primary flight instructor, and really, I've been told a lot of great things in aviation. This wasn't one that I really thought was particularly good, but he basically said, here's how it works here, kid. When you start flying, you have two giant sacks. One is full of luck and the other's full of experience. When you start flying, you got a big bag full of luck and nothing in the experience bag, and your entire flight career is going to be to see if you can transfer enough luck into the experience bag so that you've always got something to put on the job. Because if you run out of luck before you get enough experience, you're going to die up there. And it's exactly right. I've done a couple things that were stupid, but I haven't done 5 stupid things in a row. Maybe I've done 2 stupid things in a row, but not 3 or 4. And just pre-flighting your airplane thoroughly is one of them. So, as a result of this, I now, as part of my pre-flight, I check the bolts on the elevator. I check to make sure that when the elevator on the canard, when I move the elevator, that all the bolts are where they're doing and they're not rotating. And then before I move on, I grab the canard with both hands and I go like that. I mean hard, really hard. And the whole airplane goes because that means the bolts are attached. And so Steve Drybread is saving some lives, I hope. Anyway, that's about that.